Hello, friends. Today, we're diving into an incredible book, Take Your Life Back by Arthur Byrne, M. Stephen, and David E.T. Let me tell you a story. Meet Chris. His life always felt like a tangled mess. From childhood to adulthood, it seemed like every challenge, every hurt, had found a permanent corner in his world. He often wondered, why do I always feel stuck? Why do my decisions never seem to work out? This question echoed in his mind, day after day. One evening, after returning home from a long, exhausting day at work, Chris noticed a book lying on his bedside table. Its title caught his eye, Take Your Life Back: How to Stop Letting the Past and Other People Control You. Intrigued, he picked it up and muttered to himself, let's see if this has something new to teach me. Now, Chris wasn't someone who enjoyed reading, but this time, something felt different, like he was ready for a change. He opened the book and began with the first chapter, Understanding Trauma's Impact. At first, it seemed like a heavy topic, but as he read further, he realized something remarkable. It felt like the book was telling his own story. The chapter explained how trauma, whether from childhood or later in life, profoundly affects our mental and emotional well-being. As Chris read, memories from his past started surfacing. He grew up in a small town. His father was strict, and his mother was always quiet. Even his smallest mistakes often led to scolding and anger. Chris remembered a time when he performed well in school, but his father's only response was, "You could have done better." From that day on, Chris began lowering his expectations of himself. One line in the book hit him hard. Recognizing how past experiences shape current behaviors is crucial for personal growth and healing. It was like a light bulb went off in his mind. Maybe, he thought, the way I behave today is just a reflection of the shadows from my past. He began questioning himself. Why do I always undervalue myself? Why do I constantly seek validation from others? Why do I feel like I'm not good enough? The authors emphasized the need to identify and confront trauma. But the question kept nagging Chris, how do I do that? The night grew late, yet his mind remained restless. Closing the book, he walked to the window and gazed outside. The cool breeze brushed against his face as he thought deeply, can I really change something in my life? Can I let go of this baggage from my past? The next day at work, he found himself distracted, his thoughts circling back to the book. During lunch, he pulled it out again and reread the chapter. This time, a specific tip stood out. Start by journaling your thoughts. Write down your experiences, your fears, and your feelings. This will help you uncover patterns in your behavior. That evening, Chris returned home, determined to try. He grabbed a brand new notebook and sat down. The blank pages seemed daunting, yet they held the promise of something transformative. On the first page, he wrote, "Why do I feel like I'm not good enough?" Beneath it, he began listing moments from his life when he felt that way. The school days when he was humiliated in front of friends. The time in college when his hard work went unnoticed. The countless instances at work where promotions went to others, and he blamed himself for not being enough. As he wrote, he began to notice a pattern. Each time something went wrong, he had internalized the blame. Every critique from others made him feel smaller. By the time he put down his pen, Chris felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. It wasn't all gone, but it was lighter, as if he had taken the first step in unburdening his heart. That night, before opening the book again, he made himself a promise, I will change these patterns in my life. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and the book had warned that healing is a process, it takes time. Chris wondered, can this book really guide me? Am I truly ready to leave the past behind? His answer was a tentative, maybe yes. The following morning, he woke up feeling slightly lighter. It was subtle, but it was there, a glimmer of hope. He realized that the act of writing about his past had been like opening a window in a dark, locked room of his mind. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead was long. That evening, Chris picked up the book again. The title of the next chapter intrigued him, The Importance of Self-Awareness. As he started reading, he felt a spark of anticipation. This, he realized, could be the next key step in reclaiming his life. Chris had always been fascinated by self-help books. One evening, while flipping through the pages of a new book, a line caught his eye: "Without self-awareness, one cannot truly understand their life." Curious, Chris read further. Self-awareness is about reflecting on your thoughts and emotions, not just looking within but understanding how your present feelings are connected to past experiences. This sentence lingered in Chris's mind. It nudged him to revisit his own past, a history often overshadowed by overthinking. Chris had this habit of dissecting every little thing. If a friend took longer than usual to reply to a message, he'd assume he had said something wrong. If his boss gave constructive feedback, Chris would spiral, believing he wasn't good enough. That night, after reading those words, Chris closed the book, picked up his journal, and began writing. "Why do I feel insecure so often?" Underneath, he jotted down 3 moments that still haunted him. That day in college when, after a presentation, a friend casually remarked, "It would have been better if you were more confident." That moment at work when someone else took credit for his hard work and Chris stayed silent. That party where he felt like a wallflower, convinced he wasn't interesting enough. As he wrote, a pattern started to emerge. The root of all these feelings was a single fear. What if people don't like me? Chris leaned back in his chair, and a memory surfaced: a 5th grade classroom. His teacher had scolded him in front of everyone for not knowing an answer. The shame of that day had stuck with him, carving a deep belief. "If I'm not perfect, I'll be judged." He scribbled in his journal. Maybe this is where it all started. But how do I break free from this? The next day at work, Chris decided to try something different. When a colleague pointed out a mistake in his project, he felt anger and embarrassment bubble up. His first instinct was to defend himself, but he paused and asked, "Why am I feeling this way? Is it really about this feedback, or is it my insecurity speaking?" He realized it wasn't the feedback itself, it was the old belief whispering, "You're not good enough." Chris took a deep breath and told himself, "This is just feedback. It doesn't define my abilities." For the first time, he responded calmly, thanking the colleague for pointing it out and promising to fix it. That evening, Chris returned to his book. It suggested practicing self-awareness by regularly journaling thoughts and emotions. It also emphasized identifying patterns. Which situations make you feel the most insecure or anxious? Chris opened a fresh page in his journal and wrote, "Why do I often undervalue myself around others? Can I be happy without needing others' validation? Are my reactions shaped by the current situation or my past experiences?" As he wrote, a sense of clarity began to emerge. But alongside it was a lingering fear. Can I really overcome these insecurities? The book reassured him. Self-awareness is just the first step. It's a process, one that helps you recognize both your weaknesses and strengths. But more importantly, it's about taking action. Chris pondered, what does taking action mean for me? He promised himself to work on his thoughts daily, to pause and question his emotions whenever he felt inadequate. Before bed, Chris wrote in his journal, "I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. And maybe that's enough." A week later, during a meeting, Chris found himself under the spotlight. His boss questioned one of his ideas. Normally, this would have made him shrink back, doubting himself. But this time, he noticed the insecurity creeping in and stopped it in its tracks. He calmly responded, explaining his thought process. To his surprise, his boss nodded in approval. Chris felt a small but significant shift inside, a quiet confidence. He knew the journey ahead was long, but he had learned something invaluable. Running from your fears only gives them power. Facing them, with self-awareness, gives you the chance to rewrite your story. And that's exactly what Chris was doing, one thought, one action, one day at a time. Chris's life was far from over, in fact, it was slowly transforming. The last 2 chapters of the self-help book had taught him something profound: understanding himself and recognizing his emotions was essential. He had started maintaining a journal regularly, jotting down his thoughts and feelings every day. However, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the real test of his journey was still ahead. One evening, after returning from work, he picked up the book again. The next chapter was titled Setting Boundaries. As soon as he read the title, Chris took a deep breath. He knew this might be the toughest chapter for him yet. He began reading the first paragraph. Establishing boundaries is essential for a healthy life. By learning to say no and prioritizing your personal needs, you take control of your life instead of letting others control it. Chris paused. Boundaries? Had he ever had any boundaries in his life? It felt like he had spent his entire existence trying to please others and live up to their expectations. Memories started flooding in, how, even as a child, he never said no to anyone, even when it made him uncomfortable. He thought about the countless times his friends had asked for favors, and he always obliged, even if it meant sacrificing his own priorities. At work, whenever a colleague dumped their tasks on him, Chris couldn't muster the courage to refuse. Yet, every single time, he felt used, like people took his help for granted. He read further. Boundaries aren't walls meant to keep people out but guidelines that define what is acceptable for you. This struck a chord deep within him. Maybe boundaries weren't about pushing people away but about helping them understand his limits. The book suggested that the first step to setting boundaries was identifying one's needs and priorities. Chris opened his journal and wrote down 3 questions. What do I need to feel happy and fulfilled? What makes me uncomfortable or drains me? Why do I always put others before myself? As he wrote, Chris realized that he had never truly given importance to his own needs. He had been living life on everyone else's terms, losing himself in the process. The book had another powerful message. Learning to say no isn't selfish, it's self-care. Chris read that line repeatedly. Saying no was perhaps the hardest thing for him, but if he wanted to change his life, he had to learn. The next day at work, Chris got the chance to put this into practice. A colleague who often pushed his tasks onto Chris approached him again, casually saying, "Hey, Chris, could you take care of this for me? I'm swamped and won't have time." Chris's first instinct was to agree, but he stopped himself. He took a deep breath and reminded himself, this isn't my responsibility. If I do this, I'll once again sideline my own priorities. With a slight smile, Chris replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm really busy with my own tasks. I think you'll have to manage this one yourself." His colleague looked surprised, maybe even a little annoyed, but he didn't argue. For the first time, Chris felt empowered. Saying no wasn't as terrible as he had imagined. In fact, it felt like a small victory. That evening, he returned home and wrote in his journal. "Today, I said no, and it made me feel strong. Maybe I don't have to please everyone all the time." The book's next section emphasized the importance of communication. If you don't openly express your feelings and expectations, people won't understand them, it said. Chris reflected on this. Communication had always been a challenge for him. Whenever someone imposed their desires on him, he would either go silent or fail to articulate his feelings. But now, he resolved to change that. He thought about his weekends, when his family often dragged him along to various outings, regardless of whether he wanted to go. Sometimes, Chris just wanted some time alone, but he could never say no. Gathering his courage, he spoke to his mom one evening. "Mom, I love spending time with you all, but sometimes I need a little time for myself. Would it be okay if I skipped the outing next weekend?" His mom was surprised at first, but she listened. "Of course, Chris. Do what feels right for you," she said. It felt like a monumental step for Chris. He had voiced his needs and, more importantly, they were understood. The book had one final thought that stayed with him. Boundaries not only protect you but also teach others how to treat you. Chris realized that if he didn't define his limits, people would continue to cross them, often unintentionally. That night, he made another list in his journal. "At work, I won't take on tasks that aren't my responsibility. I'll prioritize my own mental and physical well-being. I'll communicate my feelings clearly and assertively." Chris knew this wasn't going to be easy. Years of people-pleasing habits wouldn't disappear overnight. But as he closed his journal, he smiled. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was taking control, not of others, but of himself. And that, he realized, was the most liberating feeling of all. Chris sat down with a deep sigh. Life had been overwhelming lately, and he realized it was time to set some boundaries, not just with others, but with himself. He decided to make 3 commitments. 1. To prioritize his free time and not let it get taken for granted. 2. To stop saying yes to everything at work, especially when it wasn't feasible. 3. To have honest conversations with people who repeatedly overstepped his boundaries. Chris also realized something profound. Setting boundaries didn't mean being harsh. It simply meant expressing his needs and feelings clearly. The very next week, his boss handed him a new project. It was huge, and Chris knew he couldn't manage it alongside his current workload. Normally, he would have accepted it without question, overloading himself to meet everyone's expectations. But this time, he took a deep breath and said politely, "Sir, I believe this project might be better suited for someone else. If you could allow me some time, I'd like to focus on completing my current tasks first." To Chris's surprise, his boss nodded and reassigned the project to someone else. That moment was an eye-opener for Chris. Setting boundaries didn't lead to people being upset or rejecting him. If communicated respectfully, people could understand and even appreciate his honesty. He reflected on this later, realizing that boundaries weren't just about protecting his time, they were about creating freedom. Freedom from guilt, resentment, and exhaustion. They were a way to reclaim a life that felt truly his. Chris promised himself he would uphold these healthy boundaries moving forward. He knew it wouldn't be easy, there would be moments of guilt, and there would be people who would challenge his limits. But he also knew that without boundaries, his life would once again revolve around others' expectations. That evening, Chris picked up a self-help book he had been reading. He flipped to the next chapter, titled The Power of Forgiveness. He paused, the word forgiveness lingering in his mind. It was heavy, loaded with emotions he hadn't fully unpacked. Taking a deep breath, Chris began to read. The book explained that forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's wrong actions, it was about freeing yourself from the weight of resentment and guilt that ties you to the past. That line hit him hard. Chris closed his eyes and asked himself, who am I still angry at? And have I forgiven myself? For years, he had been carrying unspoken grievances. He thought back to his childhood when his father, in a moment of frustration, had scolded him harshly for scoring poorly on a school test. From that day, Chris lived with the fear that he would never meet his father's expectations. Another memory surfaced from college. His best friend, someone he had trusted like a brother, had betrayed him over something trivial. They argued, and the friend walked away, never looking back. Since then, Chris had never let anyone get too close to him again. And then there was the hardest part, his mistakes. Chris had made several missteps in his career, strained a few relationships, and every time, he had held himself solely responsible. He had been so hard on himself, carrying the blame like an invisible weight on his shoulders. The book continued, forgiveness begins with a decision. It doesn't mean forgetting the hurt caused by others, but it's about letting go of the pain to heal yourself. This struck a chord. Forgiving wasn't about absolving others, it was about liberating himself. Chris closed the book, pulled out his journal, and on the first blank page, he wrote in bold letters. Who do I need to forgive? For a moment, he froze, staring at the empty page. Then, slowly, he began to write. Dad, for never telling me he was proud of me. My friend, for walking away and breaking my trust. Myself, for believing I was weak. As soon as he wrote those words, Chris felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if he had unlocked a door he hadn't known existed. For so long, he had buried these feelings deep within, never truly addressing them. The next day, something small happened at work. A colleague brought up an old mistake Chris had made and teased him about it. Normally, Chris would have snapped back or let the resentment simmer all day. But this time, he paused and asked himself, will this anger get me anywhere? He took a deep breath, smiled, and let it go. For the first time, Chris realized forgiveness wasn't just for the big, dramatic moments in life. It was for the little, everyday frustrations too. That evening, back at home, Chris picked up the book again. The next section spoke about an equally important concept, self-forgiveness. It explained that while people often focus on forgiving others, forgiving oneself is the hardest and most crucial step. Chris remembered a time in college when he had been careless during a group project. His mistake had caused his entire team to lose a significant opportunity. Since then, he had been obsessed with perfection, terrified of repeating that failure. The book's words echoed in his mind: self-forgiveness doesn't erase your mistakes. It acknowledges them, learns from them, and frees you to move forward. Chris smiled faintly, closed the book, and whispered to himself, "I forgive you, Chris." For the first time in years, he felt a lightness he couldn't explain. Chris sat quietly in his room, staring at the empty page of his journal. Slowly, he wrote, "I forgive myself for not being perfect. I forgive myself for being human." Those words lingered in his mind, echoing a truth he had never fully embraced. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't just about others, it was about releasing himself from the weight of anger and regret. Yet, as Chris reflected, a question gnawed at him: could he forgive his best friend who had betrayed him? Could he have the courage to open up to his father about the burden he had carried for years? The next morning, Chris decided to face his fears. He sat down with his dad, hesitating before speaking. "Dad, I've always felt like I wasn't good enough for you, like I couldn't live up to your expectations. Were you ever truly proud of me?" His father was taken aback. He stared at Chris for a moment, then said, "Why would you think that, son? I've always been proud of you. Maybe I didn't say it enough, but I've always believed you'd do great things." Tears welled up in Chris's eyes. He realized that all these years, he'd been carrying unnecessary guilt, thinking he was a disappointment. For the first time, he felt lighter, as though a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. That night, he opened his journal again and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't just about letting go, it's about uncovering the truth hidden beneath the pain." But Chris knew his journey wasn't over. He still had to face his friend and, more importantly, continue the practice of forgiving himself. Later that night, he picked up a self-help book he'd started reading and turned to the next chapter titled, "Taking Responsibility for Your Life." The words seemed to jump off the page as though they were written just for him. Chris read the first paragraph and then closed the book, taking a deep breath. He realized the lesson ahead would be tough. Over the past few weeks, he had faced his buried emotions, forgiven past wounds, and set boundaries. Now, the book challenged him to answer a harder question: are you ready to take full responsibility for your life? He paused and asked himself, have I been blaming others for my failures and mistakes? Slowly, clarity began to emerge. Chris thought back to his first job after college. When it didn't work out, he had blamed his boss, telling himself, "They didn't train me properly." But now, he wondered if he had truly given his best effort. Another memory surfaced, his failed relationship. He had always said, "She didn't understand me." But had he really been open and honest about his feelings? He opened the book again. One line hit him hard: taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. It means recognizing that your actions, choices, and mindset shape your outcomes. For the first time, Chris felt a sense of relief. Responsibility wasn't about self-punishment, it was about empowering himself to create change. He grabbed his journal and wrote down 3 questions. Why didn't my first job work out? Why did my relationship end? What changes can I make in my life? As he answered these questions, Chris noticed a pattern. He had spent years blaming people and circumstances for his struggles. Now, he understood that real change required accountability. The next day, Chris decided to take a small but meaningful step. He resolved to put his full effort into a project at work, without making excuses. Previously, he would think, why try hard if the boss or team doesn't support me? But this time, he approached it differently. He did extra research, communicated clearly with his team, and poured his energy into the project. When it was completed, his boss praised his effort. For the first time in years, Chris felt the power of taking charge. That evening, he returned home, picked up his book, and read the next section. Empowerment begins when you stop waiting for others to fix your problems. Start with small, actionable steps to create the life you want. He wrote in his journal. I will no longer wait for someone else to solve my problems. I will take charge of my own life. Chris knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Taking responsibility after years of relying on others felt daunting, but it also made him feel stronger. He started showing his family the same mindset shift. In the past, if something at home wasn't done, Chris would blame his parents or siblings. But now, he decided to take initiative. He cleaned the house, repaired old furniture, and inspired his family to take ownership of their roles. One line from the book resonated deeply with him. When you take responsibility, you don't just change your actions, you redefine your identity. Chris realized that each step he took wasn't just about fixing problems, it was about becoming the person he wanted to be. He wasn't just forgiving himself for past mistakes, he was embracing the power to shape his future. And for the first time in his life, Chris felt truly free. Reclaim your power. No one else can control your happiness and success unless you let them. Chris had jotted down this line in his journal. Something about it struck a chord deep within him. He had been holding on to resentment for far too long, blaming others for the way his life had turned out. That night, he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out to his old friends. Friends he had distanced himself from, convinced they didn't value him. But as the messages were sent, he realized the truth: relationships are a two-way street. If you want them to thrive, you have to nurture them. Chris opened up, apologized, and made an effort to reconnect. Slowly but surely, his friendships began to heal. And in doing so, he discovered something important: friendship isn't just about having fun, it's also about responsibility. But that wasn't the only area of his life Chris wanted to improve. For years, he had told himself he didn't have time to focus on his health. "I'm too busy," was his favorite excuse. But deep down, he knew it was just that, an excuse. One morning, he woke up early, laced up his sneakers, and went for a jog. It wasn't easy at first, but as the days turned into weeks, he started to feel more energized. He cut back on junk food and found that small, consistent changes made a huge difference. For the first time in a long time, Chris felt like he was in control of his life. One evening, after a long day, he sat down with the book that had started it all, the book that had inspired him to take his life back. He had been reading it chapter by chapter, soaking in every lesson. That night, he reached the final chapter. The title read, "Living a Fulfilled Life." The very first line struck a nerve. Fulfillment doesn't come from a perfect life. It comes from living with purpose, gratitude, and authenticity. As he read those words, a flood of memories came rushing back: the pain he had endured, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned. He thought about how far he had come and realized it all boiled down to one thing: taking responsibility for his own happiness. But there was still one question lingering in his mind. What's my purpose? Chris took a deep breath and asked himself, what can I do that will truly bring me joy and fulfillment? Then it hit him. Writing. He had always loved to write. As a kid, he used to fill notebooks with poems and short stories. But somewhere along the way, life happened, and that passion got buried under responsibilities and excuses. That night, he pulled out an old notebook and began to write. It wasn't just any story, it was his story. A story of pain, growth, and resilience. As the words flowed onto the page, he realized something profound: writing was his way of healing. Each sentence felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. A few days later, Chris read another line in the book that resonated deeply with him. Fulfillment also comes from giving back. When you share your experiences, your knowledge, or even just your time, you create a ripple effect of positivity. That gave him an idea. Why not share his story with others? Chris started posting excerpts from his journal on social media. At first, he was hesitant, afraid people might judge him or not take him seriously. But to his surprise, the response was overwhelming. Messages started pouring in from strangers thanking him for his honesty. "Your story gave me the courage to face my own struggles," one person wrote. For the first time, Chris realized that his journey wasn't just about him. His experiences, his lessons, and his growth could inspire others. And that realization brought him more happiness than he had ever imagined. Months later, Chris completed his book. He titled it, "Take Your Life Back: My Journey of Healing and Growth." It was the same title he had seen on the cover of the book that changed his life. When the book was published, it reached people far and wide. Every time someone told Chris how his story had impacted their life, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about knowing that his pain and perseverance had meaning. Chris didn't stop there. He mended relationships with his parents, reconnected with old friends, and even started building new ones. He was no longer the man who let life happen to him. He was the man who took charge of his own destiny. One day, Chris wrote in his journal for the final time. "I faced my pain, embraced forgiveness, set boundaries, taken responsibility, and found my purpose. I'm finally living my life with intention. I've reclaimed my power." As he closed the journal and smiled, he knew life would still have its challenges. But now, he was ready to face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that true happiness comes from within. Chris's story wasn't over, it was just the beginning of a brand new chapter. A chapter filled with purpose, gratitude, and the unwavering belief that we all have the power to take our lives back. Recognizing these moments was the first step Chris took to move forward in life. In the second lesson, he learned to deeply understand himself. Chris examined his emotions, habits, and decisions, realizing how much anger he harbored toward others' mistakes. This awareness became the foundation for meaningful change within him. In the third lesson, Chris learned how to establish healthy boundaries. He mastered the art of saying no, and began prioritizing what truly mattered to him. No longer burdened by others' expectations, he took control of his decisions and his life. The fourth lesson taught Chris the power of forgiveness. He forgave his father, his friends, and most importantly, himself. This act of forgiveness lifted a weight off his heart, bringing him a profound sense of peace and clarity. In the fifth lesson, Chris embraced the idea that real change begins with taking responsibility for one's own life. He stopped making excuses and started taking his work, relationships, and health seriously. The final lesson was the most transformative. Chris learned to live his life with purpose and joy. He rediscovered his passion for writing and began sharing his story with others. Not only did this bring him immense satisfaction, but it also gave him the opportunity to inspire and uplift others along the way. Chris embraced all these lessons, transforming his life into one that was authentically his own, filled with happiness, contentment, and self-reliance. So, my friends, this was today's book summary. How did it resonate with you? Let us know in the comments below. And thank you for listening to the end.